the CTAD Clinic. My name's Dr. Mike Lloyd and I'm the director of the clinic. Today we're going to be filming from the grounds of the CTAD Clinic in a demonstration video. One of the things that I get asked a lot in clinical practice is to find a way of being able to describe what dissociative identity disorder actually is all about in ways that are very easily translatable, or ways that people can then talk to their friends, their family or professionals if needed, to help explain exactly what it is and why we see this as a result of things like extended childhood trauma. What I'd like to do today is a practical demonstration in a way that I talk it through with people. Being that it's a sunny day and I'm outside, I actually get the opportunity of using a bit of space and try and explain or show an explanation of how I conceptualize DID. This would also include other specified dissociative disorders, or not otherwise specified. Hopefully it'll be useful as a way of explaining to others exactly kind of what the concept of having internal parts is and how they are formed from trauma. The premise of the explanation is that we all have a certain amount of space within which we can tolerate the things that are happening for us. This would be called potentially our window of tolerance, or just how much resilience any individual person has. So you might have a great deal of resilience, you might be an adult with a good life and have plenty of space like this large glass, or you might be, say, a teenager who has less resilience because they haven't got that sort of worldly wisdom built up yet. Or it could be that you're a young child, or a very young child. So the amount of space that we have is our resilience, our ability to be able to cope and withstand trauma. If we see this jug of water as being the potential trauma that a person may experience, you can see that if we slosh a bit in the glass, then that person can hold a certain amount of trauma, and they have space within the glass within which to manage and to cope. So there is still room for manoeuvre. So that's the ability for them to be able to think and engage in processes which may reduce the impact of that trauma. Hopefully, single event trauma can be managed, it can be put back, it can be dealt with or processed, and the person then is free to manage. There'll always be additional bits, so small traumas may happen, bereavements for example, redundancies, losses, things like that, that the everyday parts of life still impede and still add into the amount of trauma that we can carry. The hope is that maybe we can share it with another individual, lighten the load so you don't carry so much. This person can then take that away and it can be processed elsewhere. If, for example, the amount of trauma comes in is huge, it's an event that hasn't been foreseen or can't be predicted, the person isn't ready and isn't able to be able to manage that trauma, what happens is the trauma comes in and inevitably overflows, and the trauma completely fills that person, so the whole world is absolutely taken up with that trauma. There isn't any space to deal with anything else. Their memory might be affected, their ability to concentrate, to be able to deal with any aspects of life, because there is simply no space. So anything else that comes through has nowhere to go. So you try and add more trauma, more things happen, the person just overloads and overloads. Now in this example, all of the trauma that's overloading from the glass is just disappearing, it's just pouring off the bench. That's not really how things work in actual life, because if we can't contend with something, it's not that the thing that we can't manage just goes away and says, well, I can't cope with that, so therefore it'll disappear. That's really not how things are. So if we see it being much more like this, that if the water comes in and overloads, it simply moves to a different space. It fills a different container. So if we want to think about childhood trauma using these methods, we have a child. They have a certain amount of resilience. Hopefully they have plenty of space within which to deal with difficult things going on in life. There's a certain amount of trauma that takes place. The child manages, they cope, they do okay. But on the second day, more comes in. The third day, more comes in. Fourth day, more comes in. The fifth day, more comes in. over a period of weeks and months, and this is what we call the complex trauma. So the trauma is often formed by the systems within which that child lives. So for example, the families or the associates around that family are adding to that trauma on a regular basis. So there is a consistent level of trauma that that child is experiencing. So for example, neglect or abuse, which takes place over months and potentially years of a child's life. Inevitably what happens is the child very quickly becomes overloaded, and yet the trauma does not change. And even if the child is overloaded at the end of one day or 1 week or 1 month, more trauma is coming in. The child has no ability within which to cope. On a neurobiological level, the brain systems are supposed to be able to deal with a certain amount of trauma. So the relationship between our hypothalamus and our amygdala brings this into context. So it allows for a certain amount of trauma, but it does become easily overwhelmed. And the younger the child means the younger the brain, the less the ability is for the brain to be able to actually hold that trauma. So what happens is the child is full of trauma, and yet more trauma is coming in, and the glass overflows. The child loses the ability to cope with the trauma. Dissociation occurs at this point when the child has no other ability to be able to cope with the trauma, and yet more trauma is pouring in. It does not stop. So the child lacks the ability to be able to prevent trauma from happening. It lacks the ability to be able to manage and deal and process with that trauma because of the age of the child. And we're dealing with potentially children of 1, 2, 3 years old. So they do not have the cognitive abilities to be able to withstand and manage that trauma. So there has to be another system. The trauma is coming in, the child cannot cope, and it's moving elsewhere. So what we see is the trauma is held within the brain in a different way. So you can see, here it is, here's the extra trauma. And effectively, my explanation for dissociative identity disorder, DID, OSDD, is that the brain finds other vessels within which to carry that trauma. So what it does is it very carefully adds to these different things. It does a better job than I'm doing of this, by the way. So instead of this one child, so this child is holding as much trauma as they can manage, and yet there are additional vessels holding more trauma here, and here, and here. Some becomes evident, is seen and known, it's held in a slightly different place, and some might be invisible and held within an amnesic barrier, so even though it's there, it can't be seen through. So here we have the child who is managing as much of the trauma as they can, and yet the trauma is held in different places within the brain. And as the child grows, aspects of the trauma will be forgotten and the child will move on, and yet the vessels which contain the original trauma, they remain in place. They don't disappear, they remain in place because the event trauma has not changed. And actually more vessels may be required to contain more trauma as the child grows, as the trauma is moved around. And then what we see here is a system where you have the child, we have these different vessels of different shapes, sizes, could be ages, could be different varieties. These are the vessels that we call parts or alters within the DID or OSDD system. And some may sit very separate from the child, or some may sit within the child. All depends on the nature of the dissociation. That's part of the assessment process that we try to understand. So when we look at this, what we see then, we have our child who grows into the adult, and the trauma is passed from the child to the adult as much as is remembered, as much as is remembered, and yet these other vessels containing the different amounts of trauma remain present in the life. The child may grow into an adult and move away, and yet remaining present are these systems, these alters, the parts, the others that contain the trauma. This has been a way that I've used to describe dissociation to people in terms of the impact of complex trauma, and a way of being able to help people understand using imagery and metaphors about glasses too full and what have you. So I hope that this is a useful way for me to be able to describe to you how I visualize how trauma works, and then as a therapist our job is to try and understand the nature and what these parts have been carrying ultimately to be able to move them on within therapy, so that gradually the trauma that is being held within these parts gets processed and gets moved on. And then what happens to these parts is up to the individual to make a decision, and it's up to the parts to make a decision because they have their own thoughts and they have their own feelings about this process. That's all part of therapy. Hopefully this video has helped. There are other videos on the CTAD Clinic site if you'd like to like and subscribe for future content. I'll be making more videos, probably not many more outside, although it has been a very sunny day, and I hope this has been an interesting way of looking at dissociation. So thank you very much for listening, and take great care.